On this, the June 8th, 2023 edition of What's Going On with Shipping, is cargo moving on the West Coast? I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So there's a lot of discussion going on with the ongoing labor negotiation between the Pacific Maritime Association that represents the 29 ports on the west coast of the United States versus the ILWU. This is the International Longshore Warehouse Union, and their ongoing dispute about a labor negotiations. The ILWU represents the 22,000 dock workers. And since the end of June last year, yes, June 30th of 2022, the West Coast has been without a signed labor agreement. They're basically working under the provisions of the old labor agreement. Now, they started their renegotiations back in May of last year, and this has been going on for over a year. This past week, we've seen a series of issues of happening in the ports that have gotten both sides to point fingers at each other. The Pacific Maritime Association, which is a conglomerate of the ocean shipping carriers, these are the big shipping firms, the terminal operators, cranes, warehousing, you name it, everything that's kind of deals with the ports on the West Coast, have basically made the argument that the ILWU is staging a work slowdown. Not enough workers are showing up, and therefore they're not striking. This is an issue that's been erroneously reported, but that the ILWU is staging these slowdowns. On the flip side, the ILWU is making the point that the PMA, the Pacific Maritime Association, is not hiring sufficient gangs and crews to work the vessels. We've seen this up in Seattle, where they'll hire maybe one gang to work a vessel that would normally take 2 or 3 gangs to work it. They don't get the productivity they want, and therefore they fire the gang first thing in the morning. So we're seeing an issue where both sides are pointing fingers at each other, and this is making it into the mainstream news. What I want to do is kind of break apart some of these stories, look at whether or not we actually have cargo and ships moving on the West Coast, to give you a little further, deeper information on this story. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, so you'll be alerted about new stories as they come out. All right, let's go ahead and jump into some stories. So I have a link to these stories in the show notes so you can take a look at them. The first one is this Bloomberg story. West Coast ports see extended disruptions as labor talks drag on. And it's a pretty good summary of what's going on. However, I will say that you have to be careful about who you're quoting in these stories. And in this story, they quote Mario Cordero, who is the head of the port of Long Beach. He's the executive director. Now, Mario is a former head of the Federal Maritime Commission. What he said to Bloomberg on Tuesday was this: before the last 48 hours, we were seeing a lot of progress. Obviously, there's an issue there that has caused some pause in the discussions. Now, while Mario and Gene Soroka over at LA have been in the news a lot, understand Mario and Gene have nothing to do with this. Nothing at all. They are the terminal landlords. They basically contract with companies to lease out the land in the ports of LA and Long Beach. The people you need to be talking to, which are not speaking at all, and this is the big problem, is the representatives from the ILWU, the International Longshore Warehouse Union, and the Pacific Maritime Association. They're the ones who are having the issues. Everything else is being heard secondhand. I'm hearing information secondhand. I am not in these negotiations. No one in these negotiations is on here talking about this. But what's going on here is 2 issues that are really stemming everything up. One has to do with automation, which would make the ports more quote-unquote efficient. U.S. ports are continually ranked as some of the least efficient ports in the world. I have a lot of truckers and drayage operators who watch my channel and will comment on this, that they have a lot of wait times and delays getting in and out of seaports, which causes a lot of issues. At the same time, you have an issue where the ILWU wants a wage increase. They are demanding a wage increase, and the PMA has got, basically, they're arguing that they want a 3-year freeze in the wages. And this is causing a lot of angst and problems, as you will see. All right, let's go ahead and look at some of these stories. So over at Lloyd's List, you'll see this story. And again, I'm going to quote major maritime venues. I can pull up the CNBCs, the MSNBCs, the Fox Business, the Bloombergs, the Reuters, all those. But I tend to go to the ones that really focus on this. So, here's Toma Renan over at Lloyd's list. West Coast disruptions extend as vessels suffer delays and cancellations. Sam Chambers over at Splash 24/7. U.S. West Coast port disruption stretches into fourth day. This is the Journal of Commerce. Interesting to note, I went to the Journal of Commerce, and their headlines had nothing to do with this, but the most read stories of the Journal of Commerce dealt with this. Seattle effectively shut. Vessel backup builds in LA Long Beach amid ILWU job actions. I mentioned Seattle at the top of the broadcast here. San Francisco Bay Blues. Oakland suffering the most from the dock worker dispute. Now, Oakland was shut yesterday, but it had to do, or excuse me, today they're shut, but it has nothing to do with this dispute. They actually had a dock worker die. And so they ended work late on Wednesday, and they were shut today for this dock worker death. So you got to be careful about what's going on. Some people are talking about this, and that's not has anything to do with this. But there are issues going on in Oakland with long delays in vessels there. And then you have this. You have the Canadian ILWU, which is separate from the U.S. So we're talking about the U.S. ILWU with their 22,000 workers in 29 U.S. ports. But at the same time, the Canadian ILWU calls a strike vote for their West Coast container ports. This is the Prince Rupert and Vancouver. And so they represent 7,200 workers on their West Coast, and they're calling for a strike now over wages. Dock workers extend job actions, delaying West Coast port cargoes. Retailers are seeking White House intervention as long-running labor contract talks falter over wages. So there's a lot of call for U.S. Government intervention. We saw that with the previous Secretary of Labor, and now we have a temporary Secretary of Labor in there, and we're seeing that kind of play out, whether or not we will see Acting Secretary Liu come in and do any sort of mediation. At the same time, we're seeing other issues come up here in the ports. So, for example, this one by Peter Tershwell, who's talking right now. He's over at S&P Global Market Intelligence. He wrote this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. Dock workers' strike missed its moment. They could have cut a better deal last year when cargo companies were earning historic profits. Well, all right, hang on, Peter. True, you could have had a better deal last year, but a deal requires both sides to come to the table. And as far as I know, no one was coming to the table. This was the big issue. There were calls for them to come to the table long before May of last year when their deal expired in June. And we see that happening. Matter of fact, there's a quote from Peter. The longshoremen want the type of increases that reflect the profitability that the carriers had earned during COVID, as if that profitability was continuing. And it's not. He goes on to say, that's where the clash is. Okay, Peter, granted, you're right. The companies are not making the profitability they made in 2021 or 2022. But as I noted in the last video on this, first quarter profits of 2023 are much higher than they've ever been in the last decade. So there is still profitability in the PMA. And the question really becomes whether or not you want to see labor. Now, the question is, are they asking for too much, the ILWU? According to reports, the ILWU is asking a wage increase of $7.50 per hour for each year of the proposed contract. This is coming from the Journal of Commerce. That would account for nearly a 100% raise in dock workers' wages over the course of the proposed 6 years. So, and you're seeing backlash against that. Let's be clear about this. I was expecting it to happen, and you can kind of see it here. There was a story from Greg Miller over in Freightways. I love Greg. I think his reporting is top notch. But his story right here really goes to the heart of that, where you see West Coast dock workers making $200,000 demand higher pay. I got to say, listen, number one, everybody should make what they can make. I would love to make the money an ILWU longshoremen make. I would also not want the job an ILWU longshoreman has. Let's be clear about that. And if you're going to raise the wages of the ILWU in a story, in my opinion, great. Then put the wages of the Pacific Maritime Association executives and their people in there, because I have a feeling they make a lot of money right off the bat. I have a feeling they're not doing this out of their altruistic heart and working a pretty minimum wage. So, everybody's making money here. The question is how much money. And the other issue is, again, we're not in those negotiations. Is the ILWU talking about the wages for incoming workers? What is that issue? Because one of the things we're seeing right now is it's really hard to get into the ILWU union, to get out of that status from a casual into a full-time union member. This case is going to keep getting kind of manipulated and twisted in this way. And again, until you hear members of the ILWU and the PMA come on these news channels and talk about this, we're hearing everything secondhand. And the question then becomes, all right, what's happening in the ports? Are we actually seeing slowdowns? Are we seeing cargo movement? Which I think is a really interesting question to ask here. I want to show this chart here. This is the last that happened back in the last time there was a slowdown in cargo. You go back to 2015. So the blue line there shows you the big backlog off of LA and Long Beach from 2020 into 2022. And you have that massive peak here when it happened in early 2022, and we hit 109 vessels off the port. And understand, one of the things that the ILWU will make a point of is that during COVID, when everybody was locked down and people weren't going to work, that's not what was happening with the ILWU. Cargo had to keep moving. And so cargo workers, dock workers went to the docks and moved the cargo. Same thing with shipping companies. The shipping firms were still moving. And that kept happening. And understand, the reason there was a backlog here, the reason this spike happens isn't because of a shortage of ships. We had plenty of ships. We had 109 ships off of LA and Long Beach. The problem was throughput of getting cargo moved out of the ports into the interior. It had to do with the infrastructure within the United States, the warehouse capacity, trucks, the rail lines, but also the technology in the ports to be able to efficiently move cargo out of the ports into the infrastructure system. And that's a big issue that the PMA is making a point about, is we need to increase the automation, not so much robot-controlled cranes, but really automated so that it is efficient for a truck drayage driver to arrive at a port and get their containers efficiently. Because one of the things we saw happen here is that drayage operators were, instead of making 3 runs to the port in a day, were barely able to make 1 run. And that was a problem. Go back to 2015, the last time contract negotiations happened, we saw a slowdown. Again, the PMA points their finger at the ILWU. The ILWU points their finger at the PMA. The PMA says the ILWU had slowdowns. They weren't working cargo efficiently. The ILWU says the PMA weren't hiring gangs. They were not paying. And therefore, you had the slowdown. This is a finger-pointing game. They love to play with each other. This is from the Port of LA. This is their latest report. I pulled this off this morning, showing you the port operations. This is their snapshot. So one of the things you see is there's 14 vessels in the Port of Los Angeles. There are several vessels holding off the port right now, 3 of them for the Port of LA. And there are 51 vessels en route, both the Port of LA and Long Beach, with approximately almost 475,000 TEU coming in. They're hiring gangs. 43 gangs are working right now. There is 0 cut in the Port of LA. Question is 43 gangs enough to work those vessels? And then you get the rest of the data there that's coming in. This is the Port of LA container vessel activity report. It shows you vessels that are at the terminals, their dates, how long they're in there for. And we're going to look at this in a minute. Some of these vessels are showing up against the berth. This is the same for the Port of Long Beach. This is the Long Beach port showing vessels that are in port. So LA is over here on the left side of the screen. Long Beach is on the right side of the screen. Green vessels represent cargo vessels. So for example, right here at Long Beach, we saw this port close down the other day with issues. So you see the MSC Lawrence sitting here. You see the MSC Teresa and the Hyundai Mars waiting to get in. And then off here, you have CMA, CGM, La Pros waiting to get into the dock. Same thing, you see Costco vessels here up against the LBCT terminal. Over at Fenix and APM, you'll see vessels sitting there waiting to get off. And then a couple of vessels sitting off. Here's an MSC vessel sitting off. You'll see vessels inbound. So a Wanhai vessel inbound, a CMA, CGM vessel inbound. You see a Mercury vessel inbound. But more importantly, I'm going to go out just a little bit further here. You see a lot of vessels heading out. So these are vessels that were shown to be on berth by those reports. YM Travel, YM Unicorn, Costco Oceana vessels, the Ever Laurel heading out, Maersk vessel heading out, NYK heading out. So vessels are moving. We're seeing vessels moving up and off the coast. So we're definitely getting cargo movement through the ports right now, not at the volume and rate that we've seen. If you come up here to Oakland, see something a little bit different with a large anchorage in the Bay Area right now waiting to get in. Now understand, this happened during the crisis of 2021, 2022. Oakland always had a bit of an issue with being efficiently able to move cargo in and out. And what happened is a lot of carriers started bypassing Oakland. They would just drop Oakland from their route. You'll see that there are vessels up against the berth here in Seattle. One of the areas we talked about was Terminal 18 here in Seattle. So we had this vessel here, the Maersk Cairo was sitting there. Here you have the APL La Har. Are we moving at the rates that we normally do? And we're not. We're seeing disruptions in the ports. And these disruptions start having problems because when you slow a vessel down by a day or two, it creates a domino effect. Once a vessel doesn't get its containers off or doesn't get its containers loaded on, then containers begin to pile up in the terminals. Drayage, trucks, and railways that were coming in to pick up containers now are delayed. And this creates disruptions along the entire supply chain. Go back to the video I did just previously on this. Add to this the issues we're seeing at the Panama Canal right now with Neo-Panamax vessels, the large vessels that can bypass the West Coast, go directly to the East and Gulf Coast, now have to reduce their load on board. Cargo being loaded on vessels heading to the east coast of the U.S. via the Suez Canal are facing increased tolls going through. Obviously, it is much faster to offload cargo on the West Coast. The distances there are much less. But understand, 80% of the U.S. population is east of a line from North Dakota to Texas. So 3/4 of the cargo that goes into L.A. and Long Beach are basically shipped out of L.A. and Long Beach. That cargo either goes on long-haul rail, long-haul trucking, or it's taken to warehouses in the area, repacked into 45 and 53-foot trailers, and then shipped. And what a lot of carriers have done because of the disruptions that have been ongoing on the West Coast during COVID, during the supply chain crisis, is they diversified their load. And so they are more willing to pay the extra money to go to the East and Gulf Coast because of the improved reliability. In other words, I'm more likely to get my container when I want it than to go through the West Coast. And this is a problem for both the ILWU and the PMA. They need to understand this. And this is why they need to resolve this issue and stop airing dirty laundry and get this agreement in place. But right now, what we're seeing is both sides are pointing fingers at each other. Normally, you would just put more cargo going through the Panama Canal. Can't do that now. So all of this is playing an issue. Plus, one of the things that this is going to start to do is drive up freight rates on the Trans-Pacific route. We're seeing that already. We're seeing an uptick in the freight rates on the Trans-Pacific. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I know it was a lot to digest, but this is a very complex issue. A lot of perspectives. Do I have all the answers? By no means do I do. And I'm the first one to admit that. Please leave comments. Share the video. Give it a thumbs up. I am all for getting input. I get a lot of sources from a lot of people in the PMA and the ILWU who can't talk publicly. That's great. I am all for constructive criticism. If you're going to be a horse's patoot and sit there and just be nasty, but as long as it's civil and we have a great discourse, I will let everybody post on the comments down below, and I'm happy to take any criticism. Again, I've been married for 30 years. I'm a tenured professor. I can take it. Not a problem. If you can, support the page. How do you do that? You can hit that super thanks button down below or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly or yearly subscriber. Until our next video, this is Sal signing off.